Hello everyone, my name is Kiana Sari and I'm a business student. And like most business students, I didn't really get the concept of inflation the first time I heard it. So that's what I'm going to be giving you guys my speech about. Now, inflation is a really tricky topic, so I'm going to need you guys to listen really carefully in order to fully grasp what I'm saying. Now, let's just get right into it. So for you to understand what inflation is, we need to first go over the two types of inflations that exist. The first one is demand pull, the second is cost push. Cost push is super rare and it only happens when supply changes and demand stays the same. But that's super rare in the United States because usually the Fed does a good job at managing that. The most common type is called demand pull inflation. And this is generally the healthy type of inflation. And it is represented by this graph right here. Now, this is demand pull inflation. These two lines right here are aggregate demand 1 and aggregate demand 2. And price starts off right here lower and increases because demand increases. And this line right here, supply stays the same. So this is demand pull inflation. That's usually the one we want to go for. Now, the most obvious case of this happening is in a growing economy. As the economy grows, so does consumer confidence, people spend more, and, inflation, price increases. The second type is the expectation of inflation, which is a little bit less common, but it did happen in the 1970s. In the 1970s, businesses and individuals alike were expecting higher interest rates, so they started spending more, and they created sort of an artificial demand, which led to demand pull inflation. They spent a bunch because they were expecting higher interest rates, and then they flatlined for the next few years. This led to something called galloping inflation, which is a rapid increase in price in a short period of time, which is rarely possible to reduce. In response, President Nixon issued Executive Order 11615, and this imposed a freeze on wages and prices to counter inflation. This did exactly the opposite. This dramatically slowed economic growth, a deadly combination which led to something called stagflation. That's when the inflation rate is high, the economic growth rate slows, and unemployment remains steadily high. This is the worst type of inflation you can have, and we learned a lot from Executive Order 11615. The third cause of demand pull inflation is the overexpansion of money supply. And we don't really have this problem in the United States, but it's been especially prevalent in Latin and Central American countries. This is when they basically print more money. I'm not sure if you guys have seen the memes on Instagram and Reddit, but Venezuela and some African countries have resorted to printing more money to increase their economy. This unfortunately did not help because unless there is an increase in economic activity, printing more money to pay off debt or overexpanding money supply would only make inflation worse because there's too much money chasing too little goods. So it's creating artificial demand for supply that doesn't exist. The final most common cause of demand pull inflation is called discretionary fiscal policy. Now, this is a term I'm sure most econ students would be familiar with, but in case you're not, according to the Keynesian economic theory, government spending drives up demand, and when the government lowers taxes, it also drives up demand, because consumers have more money available for them to spend. When government spending surpasses tax revenue, inflation occurs as a result of that budget deficit. This usually occurs during wartime when military spending increases dramatically. The two ways governments can combat this is usually by issuing bonds or printing money, which obviously doesn't work according to my last contention. Now, moving on to cost push inflation. Now, cost push inflation can be represented by this other graph I have right here. It's much similar to the last graph, but there are some important differences. So instead of demand changing, this time supply changes. These two lines are supply, this one is demand. Price starts at Q1 at this intersection right here and increases to this point right here because supply increases, or supply changes and demand stays the same. Now, like I said, in the United States, this is extremely rare. Our Fed manages this pretty well, or the Federal Reserve manages it pretty well, so we don't really run into cost push inflation. But they usually occur because, well, when a monopoly exists, wages increase, natural disasters occur, regulations are introduced, or exchange rates are changed. Now, first of all, a monopoly is a type of company so large that it controls the entire industry. One example is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They created cost push inflation in the 1970s when members restricted oil and they quadrupled prices because they can. They're a monopoly. Over 40 years later, in 2014, shale oil producers challenged OPEC's monopoly power, which led to a dramatic drop in price and the US shale oil boom and bust. The second cause of cost-push inflation goes hand in hand with something called wage inflation, which I'm sure is something we're all familiar with. Wage inflation occurs when workers force employers to increase their wages no matter the state of the economy. An example can be found in the US auto industry, starting in the 1940s. Unions pushed employers to increase wages, which forced companies to push the burden of higher costs on consumers, which causes cost-push inflation, or in this case, wage-push inflation. Now, this is well managed by the government and unions and such, so this usually doesn't happen anymore, or we try not to have it happen in the United States. A more recent cause of cost-push inflation is by natural disaster. In 2011, just a few years ago, Japan's earthquake and tsunami disrupted the supply of auto parts, limiting supply and causing inflation. Another example is during Hurricane Katrina, when massive storms destroyed oil refineries, once again causing a limited supply and a subsequent soar in gas prices. The fourth reason is by government regulation and taxation, specifically those implemented to reduce a supply of a specific good or service. Obvious examples of these are taxes on tobacco and alcohol, which were implemented to lower demand for these types of goods. Although the demand was lowered, price increased and cost-push inflation occurred for these products. The final most common is exchange rates. As a country's currency falls value, import prices increase, and it would be undesirable for foreign suppliers to continue supplying that country in order to maintain the value of the product. So economy activity slows and inflation occurs. Now, in conclusion, inflation is a tricky concept and it is pretty difficult to understand, but the Fed's monetary policy has been doing us well so far, and inflation isn't really something we need to worry about too much here in the United States, unless you're bargaining wages or something crazy like a natural disaster happens. Other than that, inflation isn't too tricky of a topic. It's easy to understand once you study it enough, and it's really important to know about. So thank you for listening.